Some doors in this world are not built to keep people out. They are built to be open from the other side, on a schedule no one living agreed to. Before the first page turns, step quietly behind the mask and take your place within the hidden circle. Leave your mark upon the threshold so the door knows you were here. Summon the next whisper so you never miss the midnight call. And if something has already followed you into this room, lean close and confess it into the dark before we begin. I spent 19 years in the probate division of a county I will not name, in a building old enough that the elevator still required a human hand on a brass lever, in a part of the state where the hills fold over each other like sleeping animals and the fog does not lift so much as relocate. I am telling you this now because I am old, and because the man who could have stopped me from telling it has been dead for some time, and because I have come to believe that silence was never the protection they promised it would be. It only postponed things. And postponement, in my experience, is the cruelest thing a system can offer a person. It lets you believe you have escaped something when all you have done is move to the back of the line. There is a particular quiet that lives inside old county buildings, and I want you to understand it before anything else, because the quiet is the first character in this story, older than any of the people in it. It is not the quiet of an empty room. It is the quiet of a room that is full of records, full of names, full of the closed accounts of the dead, and that has learned across a century to hold its breath. The radiators in that building knocked at irregular intervals all winter, a sound like someone testing the pipes from the inside. The fluorescent tubes in the basement hummed at a pitch you stopped hearing after an hour and started hearing again the moment you tried to sleep. And under all of it, there was the smell, which I will carry to whatever waits for me at the end of this, the smell of paper slowly returning to dust, sweet and dry and faintly like the inside of an old man's coat. I worked in that smell so long that when I finally left it, the clean air of the street felt like a kind of nakedness. I want to explain the work first, because the work is where the horror lives, and without the work you will think I am only a frightened old man inventing shapes in the dark. I was not frightened by shapes. I was frightened by paperwork that behaved correctly. That is a stranger thing, and a worse one. A shape in the dark can be a coat left over a chair. A document that knows the future cannot be a coat over a chair. It can only be what it is. Probate, for those who have never had the misfortune of needing it, is the legal process by which the property of a dead person is sorted, accounted for, and handed down to the living. When someone dies and leaves a will, that will must be proven genuine before a judge. When someone dies without one, the law itself decides who receives what, dividing a life among the survivors by rules written long ago by people who never met them. Either way, a file is opened. The file is the official skeleton of a person's afterlife, the bureaucratic ghost they leave behind to be argued over. It holds the death certificate, the inventory of property, the names of heirs, the petitions, the notices, the small handwritten arguments of families who loved each other right up until there was money on the table. I have read more of those arguments than any man should. People reveal themselves completely in probate. The grief is real, but the greed is real too, and they sit in the same folder on facing pages, and neither one is ever ashamed of the other. The first rule of the work, the rule that everything else depends on, is that a probate file cannot exist before a death. There is no such thing as a probate matter for a living person. You cannot inherit from someone who is still drawing breath. The death is the key that turns the lock. The death comes first. Always. The certificate is filed, the file is opened, the process begins. This is not a tradition or preference the way some office customs are. It is the entire logic of the work. Remove it and everything I did for 19 years becomes meaningless motion. A man sorting empty boxes. The death first, then the file. Water flows downhill. Some things are so fundamental that you never even say them aloud, because to say them would be to admit they could be otherwise. I tell you this so you understand what I felt when I found the first one. Not curiosity, not even surprise at first. What I felt was the specific vertigo of a man who has been told all his life that water flows downhill and then stands at the bottom of a hill and watches a stream climb the slope toward him, calmly, in no particular hurry. The way water would climb if water had somewhere it needed to be. I started in the records room in the late autumn of a year I remember mostly by its weather. because the weather that year was relentless, rain that turned to fog that turned to a freezing mist that beaded on every surface and never quite fell. I was 26, and I had taken the job the way many people take county jobs, not out of passion, but out of the quiet relief of a thing that would not change. My mother had just begun to forget my name in the small ways that come before the large ones. She would call me by my father's name, then correct herself, then look frightened, and I could not bear the frightened look, and so I wanted work that asked nothing of me but accuracy, work where I would not have to watch a person I loved disappear by degrees. The records room gave me that. It was below the level where the public was allowed, down a stairwell with a handrail worn smooth and faintly greasy from a century of descending hands. And at the bottom, there was a single window at ground level through which I could watch the feet of people walking on the sidewalk above, never their faces, only their shoes and the hems of their coats, the bottoms of umbrellas, the occasional dog. I used to find it restful, those whole lives passing by at the level of their shoes, and me below them in the quiet, sorting the dead. My supervisor was a woman named Eldred. She had been in the office longer than anyone could account for, longer than the personnel files seemed to allow, and she spoke in a way that made even simple instructions sound like warnings carried a great distance. She was thin in the way of people who have stopped expecting much from their bodies. She wore the same gray cardigan in every season, and she kept a hard candy in her cheek when she worked, so her words came out slightly displaced, as though spoken around something she was not willing to put down. She taught me the filing system, which was eccentric and entirely her own, a code of colored tabs and pencil marks that meant nothing to the state auditors and everything to her. She taught me which families to expect trouble from, which surnames would bring a lawyer through the door within the week. She taught me how to handle the old leather-bound docket books, which went back to the 1870s and had to be turned with both hands because the spines would crack if you were careless, and because, she said, you should never give a record only one hand. A record deserves both hands. I thought it was a charming superstition. I think now it was the closest thing to a confession she offered me in those early years, and she taught me one thing I did not understand for a long time, an instruction she repeated often enough that it became part of the furniture of my mind. She said, when you pull the daily filings, always check the dates against the certificates. Always, even when you are tired, especially when you are tired. She would say it the way a mother says, wear your coat, with a weariness that suggested she had said it to many people before me and buried most of them. I thought she meant it as a guard against clerical error, and that reading served me for years. People mistype dates constantly. A 9 becomes a 7 under a tired hand, a 6 rolls over into an 8, and suddenly a file claims a man died before he was born, or signed his will a year after his funeral. That happens. It is mundane. It is the bread and butter of a records clerk's vigilance. So for the first 2 years, I checked the dates the way you check your mirrors when you drive. An automatic motion emptied of real attention, my eyes moving across the numbers while my mind was elsewhere, on my mother, on my cold tea, on the shoes passing in the window. What the public knew about our office, what they were ever meant to know, was nothing at all. That was the point of us. A well-run records office is invisible, and ours was the most invisible thing in the county, a basement beneath a basement of ordinary government where the real and final accounts were kept. The closest thing to a public story about the place was an old item in the county paper, from decades before my time, about a fire. The official account said a faulty heater in the basement had caused a small blaze sometime in the 1950s, that a portion of the older records had been lost, and that the office had since modernized its storage to prevent any recurrence. It was a forgettable story, 3 short paragraphs, the kind a newspaper runs to fill the space below a photograph of a parade. I knew it only because a copy of the clipping was taped inside the front cover of one of the oldest docket books, yellowed and curling at the corners, the tape gone brown and brittle, and I used to read it on slow afternoons the way you read the back of a cereal box, for the simple animal comfort of having words to rest my eyes upon. I want you to hold on to that fire. I did not for a long time. I treated it as background, as wallpaper, as one of the small mysteries any old institution accumulates and no one bothers to solve. But the office had decided, long before I was born, that some things would be explained by fire, and I have come to understand that this is what institutions do with the truths they cannot file. They do not destroy them. They cannot. The truth is too patient for that. Instead, they burn a story into place over the top of it, a simple story, a heater, an accident, a few lost pages, and they tend that story so faithfully that no one ever thinks to look beneath. The fire was not a thing that happened. The fire was a thing that was kept. The first wrong detail arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in my 3rd year, in the dead middle of February, when the fog had come down so thick that the streetlights burned all day, and the feet in my window moved slowly and carefully, as though everyone above me had become uncertain of the ground. I was pulling the day's new filings to log them, perhaps a dozen folders, the smell of the new paper sharper and more chemical than the old, and I was checking the dates the way Eldred had drilled into me, my eyes moving down the numbers. 11 of them were unremarkable. The 12th was for a man named Harlan Voss. I have thought about Harlan Voss more than I have thought about most people I actually knew. The death certificate inside the Voss file gave a date of death written in the neat, anonymous hand of some county official. The file opening stamp, the inked impression that recorded the date our office had officially created the matter and brought it into being, was dated 4 days earlier than the death. I read it 3 times. I held the certificate up to the buzzing light and read it again. The file had been opened on a Friday. The man had died the following Tuesday. We had created the skeleton of his afterlife and given it a place on our shelf while he was, by every record we possessed, still drawing breath, still eating, still walking around inside a life he did not know was already filed. I did what anyone would do. I assumed an error, and I felt the small, clean satisfaction of a clerk who has caught one. A backdated certificate, perhaps, signed late and dated to the actual day of death, or a transposed stamp, the date wheel knocked to the wrong setting. I set the file aside to correct, and I moved on to log the others, and it sat at the edge of my desk in the fog light like a thing waiting to be noticed. And then, because I was thorough in the way lonely people sometimes are, because thoroughness was the only company I kept down there, I decided to confirm the certificate date against the county's central death index before I changed anything. The death index agreed with the certificate. Harlan Voss had died on the date the certificate gave. The Tuesday, no error. The same date recorded in a separate system maintained by separate people in a separate office upstairs who had no reason to coordinate their mistakes with ours. But our file had been opened 4 days before that. We had been ready for Harlan Voss before Harlan Voss was finished. I remember the cold that came up through the basement floor that afternoon, though it was not a cold day even for that winter, though the radiators were knocking steadily and the air was close. It came up through the soles of my shoes and settled in my knees, the particular cold of a body that has understood something before the mind has agreed to it. I remember telling myself a dozen reasonable things in quick succession, throwing reasons at the thing to make it ordinary. The certificate could be wrong despite the index. The index could be wrong despite the certificate. Someone could have opened the file improperly in anticipation, knowing the man was dying, a family eager to begin, a lawyer jumping ahead. People do break the rules. Rules being broken would have been a relief. I wanted desperately and immediately for a human being to have done this carelessly. So I went looking for the petition, the document that should have accompanied the file's creation, the request from some heir or attorney that set the whole machine in motion. Every file has one. The petition is the first thing in the folder. It is the human hand reaching for the door. It tells you who asked, and when, and on whose behalf, and it carries a signature at the bottom, a name in ink, a person taking responsibility for waking the dead into the legal world. The Voss file had a petition. It was filled out correctly in a neat and unhurried hand, with the proper case caption and the proper recitals and the proper boxes marked. But the line for the petitioner's name was blank, not erased, which would have left the faint ghost of pencil and a slight roughening of the paper, not torn away, not smudged, blank, clean, untouched, as though the form had been completed in full by someone who knew every detail of a death that had not yet happened, the cause, the date, the property, the heirs, every detail except the single human fact of who among the living would benefit from it. The one line that required a person had been left empty, and everything that required only knowledge had been filled. I should have stopped there. I have told myself that 1,000 times in the years since. But a clerk who has found an impossible thing cannot simply set it down, any more than your tongue can leave a chipped tooth alone. I carried the file up to Eldred's desk, which sat at the top of the basement stairs in a pool of warmer light, and I laid it down before her, and I pointed at the dates, and I waited for her to explain it away because that was her function in my life, to make strange things ordinary, to already know whatever I had just learned. She did not explain it away. She had a candy in her cheek and her reading glasses low on her nose, and she looked at the file for a long moment, her eyes moving exactly as mine had moved down the numbers to the blank petition line. And then she looked at me, and something in her face closed slowly and completely, like a hand drawing into a fist, like a door I had not known was open, swinging gently shut. She took the candy from her cheek and set it on a square of waxed paper she kept for the purpose, which I had never once seen her do, and the small, deliberate care of that gesture frightened me more than anything she could have said. She said very quietly, "You checked the dates." I said that I had. She said, "Good. Now put it back exactly where you found it and log it the way the file says, not the way the index says. The file is what governs in this office. Do you understand me? Whatever the index says, whatever the certificate says, whatever you remember, the file governs. We follow the file." I did not understand her, and I told her so, with the small heat of a young man who believes confusion is a problem to be argued out of. I said the file was wrong, plainly and obviously wrong, that a man could not have a probate matter opened before he died, that it violated the first principle of everything we did, and that I would simply correct it and move on. And Eldred, who had never once raised her voice to me in 2 years, who had taught me to handle records with both hands and to expect little from anyone, reached across the desk and took my wrist. Her grip was dry and cool and very strong, far stronger than her thin arm had any right to produce, and she held me there and looked up at me over her glasses and said, "If you correct it, you change what it predicts, and you will not like what it predicts when you have made it wrong." I logged the file the way it was written. I want to be honest about that, more honest than is comfortable. I did not argue further. I took the folder back down the stairs into the cold and the hum and the sweet dust smell, and I logged it as the file dictated, the Friday opening, the Tuesday death. And I carried it to the shelf and slid it into its alphabetical place between two strangers, and I told myself I was only choosing my supervisor's long experience over my own 3 years of confusion, which is a respectable thing for a young man to do, which is, in fact, exactly what a young man is supposed to do. I have never forgiven myself for it, because it was the moment I agreed to participate before I understood what I was participating in, and a man can spend the rest of his life inside a decision he made in under a minute on a foggy afternoon with his wrist held in a cool, dry hand. After that, I started watching, not correcting, watching. Eldred had taught me that, even if she had never meant to. She had taught me that the dates could be wrong in a way that mattered, and a thing once seen cannot be unseen. I began keeping a private list in a small black notebook I bought from a stationer's 2 towns over so no one in our county would sell it to me, and I kept it in the inside pocket of my coat against my chest where I could feel its small weight all day. Whenever I found a file opened before its death, I noted 3 things in my cramped, careful hand. The name, the file opening date, the death date. I told myself it was an audit. I told myself I was building a case to bring to someone above Eldred, the clerk of court perhaps, or someone at the state, that I was gathering proof the way a good clerk gathers proof, methodically, so that when the time came, I would be believed. The truth, which I admitted to myself only much later, is that I never brought it to anyone, because each new entry in that notebook made me more certain, with a certainty that grew like cold in the joints, that anyone I brought it to would simply look at me the way Eldred had looked at me and take the candy from their cheek and tell me the file governs. The pattern took shape slowly, the way a face emerges from the static on a dead television channel when you stare at it long enough in the dark. It was not every file. It was not even most. Most deaths were ordinary. The file opened a respectable interval after days or weeks, the proper order observed, the living reaching back for the dead in the proper direction. But a small number, perhaps 1 in 40, were inverted. The file came first, and in every single inverted case, without exception, across every name I recorded, the gap was identical. 4 days. The file opened 4 days before the death, every time, with a clean, unfilled petition line, and a certificate complete in every particular for a death that would not occur until the better part of a week had passed. 4 days. I have spent the rest of my life with that number. I have looked for it everywhere a number can hide, the way you scan every crowd for a face you have lost. The 4th step from the bottom of a staircase. The 4th day of an illness. 4 o'clock in the dead afternoon when the fog thickens. I have never found the 4 anywhere that mattered except in that office, in those files, in that one merciless interval the function, whatever it was, had chosen to leave between knowing and happening. The accumulation is what finally broke my ability to dismiss it, because a single impossible thing can be a mistake, and 2 can be a strange coincidence. But a pattern that holds across decades with the precision of a machine is not a mistake or a coincidence. It is a function. By the time I had 30 entries in the black notebook drawn from files spanning years before my arrival, I was no longer looking at errors that someone had made. I was looking at something the office did, quietly, consistently, with the patience of a thing that has all the time there is and no reason to hurry any of it. So I went back, past my own years, past the years of anyone living. I started reading the old docket books, the leather ones, the heavy ones that went back past the fire, turning each page with both hands as Eldred had taught me, in the long, slow afternoons when the public business was done, and the building above me emptied, and the only sounds were the radiators knocking and the lights humming and the soft rasp of old paper. And here the work turned truly dangerous because the books did not lie to me. I had half hoped they would, a lie I could have caught and held up and called a forgery. But the books told me the truth, page after page after page, in the calm hands of clerks 100 years dead, and the truth was worse than any lie I could have wished for. The inversions went back as far as the books did. The same 4-day gap, holding steady across generations like a law of nature written into the masonry. The same blank petitioner line, that one empty space no living hand had ever filled. The handwriting changed from book to book, the ink faded from black to brown to a ghostly sepia. The spelling on the forms drifted into older fashions, but the pattern did not so much as flicker. I found one from 1891, a woman named Cora Bly, her file opened on a date written in a flowing antique hand 4 days before her death by drowning. The petitioner line empty, the certificate complete down to the temperature of the river. I sat with Cora Bly's entry for a long time in the humming dark. She had been a person. She had felt the cold of that water close over her 4 days after a folder bearing her name had been slid quietly onto a shelf in a basement she would never see. I found dozens like her. Scores. The office had been opening files before death since before the office, as I understood the office, had even existed. The function was older than the building. It had simply moved into the building when the building was raised, the way water finds and fills the lowest room in any house, patiently, requiring no permission. And then I found the gap. The fire. The docket books had a span of missing years in the middle of the 1950s, exactly the years the newspaper clipping attributed to the basement blaze, a clean absence where a decade of records should have been. And I want to tell you precisely what convinced me, because it was not the absence itself. Absences can be honest. What convinced me was that the books on either side of the gap were undamaged. I examined them under the light, page by page. There was no scorching at the edges, no rippling from heat, no water stain from the hoses that would have fought a fire, no smell of smoke in pages that had faithfully held the smell of everything else they had ever lain near, the must and the dust and the faint sweetness of decay. A fire leaves its signature on its survivors. It marks the books beside the ones it takes. These books were clean. The records had not burned. They had been removed carefully with both hands, no doubt, by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. and in their place the office had said a story about a faulty heater, and it tended that story so well for so long that a clipping of it had yellowed into the front of a docket book, and a young clerk had read it for comfort on his slow afternoons. I understood then why Eldred had told me the file governs. It was not a procedure, it was a creed. It was the oldest article of faith in a religion with no name and one sacrament. The office did not investigate the function. The office served the function. The job I had taken precisely because it would never change was changeless, because it had one true task that never varied beneath all the visible tasks, and that task was to keep the door working and to never, under any circumstances, ask what came through it, or what went out, or who had built it, or where it opened. I had wanted a job that asked nothing of me but accuracy. I had gotten exactly that. The function asked for nothing else either. Only accuracy, only that the file be allowed to govern. I am going to tell you about Mr. Pell now, because if I do not tell you about Mr. Pell, I will have left out the only person who ever spoke to me plainly in 19 years, and I owe him that much, whatever he finally was. Mr. Pell was a retired man who had worked in the office decades before me, in the years close to the fire, and who still came in once a month to sit at the long reading table and look at old records, ostensibly researching his family genealogy. Everyone knew him. He had a soft, settled face and a way of being present in the basement that no one ever questioned, as though he were a fixture that had simply always been allowed. He brought hard candies in a flat tin, the same kind Eldred kept in her cheek, and he offered them around to the staff with a small, ceremonious nod. And I took one every time, and the taste of it, faintly of anise, is bound up now with everything that followed. I had spoken to him a dozen times about nothing at all, the weather, the fog, the slowness of the elevator, before the day I spoke to him about everything. I found him at the long table one gray afternoon with one of the leather docket books open before him, one of the oldest, and he was not writing anything down, only resting his hand flat on the page. And I sat down across from him without being invited, because I was tired in a way I had been tired for years by then, and frightened past politeness, and I asked him directly, with no warming up at all, whether he knew that some of the files in that office were opened before the people in them died. He did not look up. He turned a page with the careful two-handed motion of a man who had been taught exactly the way I had been taught, from the same hands perhaps, or from hands that had themselves been taught by the same, and he said, as though answering a question about the weather, 4 days. I said yes, 4 days. He said the gap had not always been 4. When he had started in the office, as a young man in the years before the fire, it had been 5. Before him, in the books his own predecessor had kept, it had been 6. He had read entries from the previous century, the entries I had read, where it stretched to as much as 11. The gap was narrowing. Slowly, across generations, across the whole long life of the office, the door was opening closer and closer to the death it foretold. He spoke of it the way a man speaks of a tide he has watched come in over a lifetime of summers, with no alarm and no hope, only a long, settled attention. He said no one knew what the gap was narrowing toward, but everyone who worked the records long enough came to understand that it was narrowing toward something, that a thing which shrinks at a steady rate is a thing with a destination, and that when the gap reached 0, the file and the death would happen in the same instant, prediction and event collapsing into a single act, and that no one had any idea at all what would come after that, when knowing and happening became one thing, because the office in all its history had never reached that point and lived to record it. I asked him what the function was, what opened the files. I asked it plainly, the question beneath every other question, the one Eldred had taught me by example never to ask. He set down his pencil, which he had been holding all this time without writing, and he folded his hands on the open page. He said the office had never had a name for it that he would trust, and that the names people invented over the years were worse than no name at all, because a name lets you believe you have understood the thing, and the worst danger of all is to believe you understand it. He said the best he could give me was this. There was a process in the county, older than the county, that decided certain things in advance, and it used the office to keep its accounts. the way a careful man writes the amount in his ledger before he goes out to spend it, so the books are never out of balance even for an afternoon. And the office's only real job, the job beneath all the visible jobs, was to keep those accounts honest and to never, ever argue with the arithmetic. And then he told me the thing that I have carried longest, the thing I would give a great deal never to have heard, and a great deal more never to have ignored. He said the danger was never in finding the files. The function tolerated witnesses. It had tolerated them for 100 years. It did not tolerate editors. He said that long ago, in the years now missing from the books, before the gap was even being formally recorded, a clerk had found a file opened before a death and had done precisely what I had wanted to do on the afternoon of Harlan Voss. The clerk had judged it a monstrous error, an obscenity, and had voided it, struck it from the record, refused to let the door stay open on a man who was still alive. I asked, though I already dreaded the shape of the answer, "What happened?" Mr. Pell looked at me then, for the first time in the conversation, and his eyes were tired in a way I have seen in only a handful of faces across my whole life, the tiredness of someone who has long ago stopped hoping to be relieved of a thing. He said the death the voided file had predicted did not occur on its appointed date. It occurred 4 days early, on the very day the file had originally been opened, as though the function, deprived of the orderly account it had set up, had simply collected the debt directly, on the schedule it had already chosen, and let the paperwork catch up to the fact afterward. The certificate filed late, the proper order restored, the books balanced once more. The clerk, Mr. Pell said, had not changed whether the man died. He had changed only one thing. He had changed whether the office got to know in time to do nothing. "That is all we do," Mr. Pell told me, and his voice had gone very gentle, the way a voice goes when it is delivering a hard truth to someone it has decided to be kind to. "We get to know in time to do nothing. It is not much. I will not pretend to you that it is much. But it is the only mercy the work allows, and a man can build a whole life inside that small mercy. A quiet life, a bearable one if he is careful, and if he never once lets himself imagine he is anything more than a clerk." He gathered his flat tin of candies and stood slowly and bid me a soft good afternoon, and he climbed the basement stairs one at a time with his hand on the worn rail. I never saw him come down to the basement again. When I asked Eldred about him some months later, casually, she told me without any particular weight, the way you mention rain, that he had passed. And I did the thing I could not stop myself from doing, the thing the work had made of me. I went to the shelf and I found his file. It had been opened 4 days before his death. The petitioner line was blank. I should tell you now what the work cost me across the years, because a horror that costs nothing is only a story, a thing to be enjoyed and set down, and this cost me my life as surely as a wasting illness, only slower and from the inside. I stopped trusting records. All of them everywhere, the small ones and the large. It is a simple sentence to say and a ruinous thing to live inside. When you no longer believe that a date is a fact, that a name printed on a form corresponds reliably to a person who breathes, that the order in which events are recorded is the order in which they truly occurred, then the entire invisible scaffolding of ordinary life develops a fine and constant tremor, like a bridge you can feel moving under your feet, though everyone around you walks across it without a thought. I would receive a letter and check the postmark twice, 3 times, comparing it against the date inside, looking for the gap. I would read an obituary in the county paper over my breakfast and feel the basement cold come up through whatever floor I happened to be standing on. In my own kitchen, in the bright morning, the cold of the place following me home in the only way it ever did for most of my life, as a permanent doubt about the order of things. My mother died during those years. I will tell you with a shame that is not faded that when the hospital placed her certificate in my hands, my very first act before grief, before anything that deserves to be called human, was to drive to the office and check whether her file had been opened before or after. It had been after, 6 days after. It was ordinary. She had died the way a person dies, of a long forgetting and then a short illness, and her account had been opened in the proper direction, the living reaching back for the dead. I should have wept with relief, standing there in the cold and the hum, Instead, I felt only the specific desolate loneliness of a man who has learned to be grateful for the mere absence of horror, and who has forgotten somewhere along the way what it was simply to be sad, to grieve a mother cleanly without first auditing her death. I did not marry. For years I told myself it was temperament, that I was a solitary man by nature, suited to a basement and a window full of shoes. I think now it was something else. I could not imagine signing a marriage license, putting my own name and a date in ink on a document and handing it across a counter, and trusting it would mean only what it said and nothing more, that it would not one day be found to have predicted something. I had seen too clearly what a document could be. I had seen documents that ran ahead of the truth and waited for it to arrive. I could never again put my faith in paper, and so much of love, in the end, is two people putting their faith in a piece of paper they sign together while choosing to believe it will hold them. The years went on. The notebook filled page after page in my cramped and steadily aging hand. The gap in the files I tracked did not visibly change across my own span of years the way it had changed across Mr. Pell's longer watch. It held at 4 days, steady, patient, content, and I began to allow myself a small and cowardly hope that I would simply finish out my long career and retire and die in some ordinary way. A heart that stopped, a quiet sleep that I would be permitted, like Mr. Pell, to spend my small mercy quietly and pass the watch to whoever came after me, and never face the function more directly than across a reading table or a filing shelf. I told myself I was a witness, only ever a witness, and that witnesses were allowed to grow old. I do not know even now whether I made the right choice in staying as long as I did. There were years when I could have left. I could have walked out of that basement and up the worn stairs and into the air and taken some clean, ordinary job in some clean, ordinary place where dates were only dates and a folder was only a folder. I told myself I stayed in order to watch, to bear honest witness to a dishonest process, to be the one set of clear eyes upon a thing that wanted no eyes upon it at all. But I have wondered in the long nights since whether I stayed for a reason far less noble. Whether I stayed because the office had become the only place on earth where I felt I understood the true shape of the world, even though that shape was monstrous. A terrible truth is still a truth, and there is a kind of person who would rather stand inside a terrible truth than out in the open air beneath a comfortable lie. I am afraid that I am that kind of person. I am not proud of it. I tell you only because I promised myself that if I ever told this story at all, I would not allow myself to be its hero, and a man who stays 19 years is not a witness. He is a participant who has chosen a comfortable name for himself. The thing I have been moving toward all this while, the thing that ended my career and very nearly ended a great deal more, came in my final year, in the deep of the last winter I worked, when the fog had settled into the valley so completely that the streetlights wore their halos from morning to morning and never once went dark, and the feet in my window moved slowly and uncertainly all day, as though every soul above me had begun to doubt the ground they walked on. I was pulling the daily filings late in the afternoon, and I was tired in exactly the way Eldred had warned me about all those years before. The deep tiredness that thins your attention to a thread, the tiredness of an old man doing an old task while his mind drifts toward his cold tea and his empty rooms. There were 9 folders that day. I checked the dates the way I had checked them perhaps 100,000 times across 19 years, my eyes moving down the numbers out of a habit so old it had become part of my body, and on the 9th folder, my heart stopped in my chest, simply stopped, and then resumed at a pace that frightened me more than the stopping. It was opened 4 days before. The petitioner line blank, clean, untouched, that one empty space no living hand had ever filled, and the name on the file was my own surname. I want to be precise here, more precise than at any point in this telling, because precision is the only dignity the work ever left me, and I will not surrender it now. The name was not exactly mine. The first name was one I did not recognize, an ordinary name, but not the one my mother had so often forgotten. The surname, though, was mine, and it is not a common name, and I knew with absolute certainty that there was no one else in that county who carried it, because my family had come to that place from somewhere far away, and I was the last of us left in it, the final bearer of a name that ended with me, The file gave a stranger's first name fixed to a surname that belonged on this earth to me alone. The death date on the certificate inside was 4 days from the very afternoon I held it in my cold hands. And the certificate was complete, not partial, not pending, not awaiting the details only the future could supply. Complete. Cause of death. Place of death. The attending official's name. The hour. All of it filled in that neat, anonymous hand I had seen on 100 inverted files across 19 years, calmly describing the death of a person bearing my name on a day that had not yet arrived, a day I could count on the fingers of one hand. I have tried many times in the years and the long nights since to describe what I felt in that moment, and the closest I have ever come is this. I had spent my entire adult life believing I was the witness, the one who got to know in time to do nothing, the clear set of eyes, and in a single instant standing in the hum and the cold with my own surname in my hands, I understood that the function had never needed a witness at all. A witness was a courtesy, a thing it permitted, the way a man permits a fly to walk the rim of his cup. What the function needed was an entry, and I had been all along, across every one of those 19 years, simply an entry that had not yet been written, walking around the basement, turning pages with both hands, keeping my secret notebook against my chest like a man strolling the corridors of a building and admiring the architecture, never once recognizing the cell that had been reserved for him since before he was born. And I did the thing I had been warned, more clearly and more kindly than anyone is usually warned of anything, never to do. I want you to understand that I did it knowing the warning in full. I did not blunder into it. Mr. Pell had told me gently across a reading table with anise on his breath that the function tolerated witnesses but never editors, that to void a file did not save the person named in it, but only moved the death forward to the file's own opening date, 4 days early. The debt collected directly and the paperwork left to catch up. I knew this. I had known it for decades, and I reached for the void stamp anyway, my old hand shaking. Because when it is your own name in the folder, the patient wisdom of a lifetime burns away in less than a heartbeat, and you are left with nothing but the animal underneath. And the animal does not care about the schedule. The animal does not care about the books being balanced. The animal wants only not to die today or in 4 days or ever, and it will reach for any stamp in the world to keep from being filed. My hand was on the stamp, the cold metal of it, the worn wooden handle, and Eldred's voice came from the top of the stairs. She was very old by then, far older than I had ever permitted myself to truly notice across our years together, as though she had been old when I arrived and had simply held there, declining to finish. She came down the basement stairs one at a time, her hand on the worn smooth rail, her gray cardigan the same gray cardigan it had always been, and she said my name, only my name, into the hum and the cold, and at the sound of it my hand stopped above the stamp. She crossed the room to the filing table slowly, and she looked down at the open folder, at my surname, at the complete certificate, at the blank petition line, and she did not seem surprised, not in the smallest degree, and in that absence of surprise I understood at last the thing the office had truly been built to do. It had never been built to serve strangers. The strangers, the Vosses and the Bliss, the 1 in 40, were incidental, the visible business that hid the real one. The office had been built to season the people who worked it, year by patient year, file by file, until the day each of them found their own surname waiting on the 9th folder of an ordinary afternoon. The watch was never a job. It was a sentence served slowly, and Eldred had been serving hers, and Mr. Pell his, and now mine had come due. She said, "If you void it, you die in 4 days, less than 4. You die today. Now, you know this. He told you. I know he told you, because I sent him to you." I said I could not simply let it stand. I said the worded as though it were a person in the room with us, which perhaps it was. I said it would not let me only wait, that no man could be expected to read his own certificate and simply set it back on the shelf. And she told me the last thing anyone in that office ever told me, the thing I have turned over in my hands every single night since. And she told it without cruelty, almost with tenderness, the way you tell a frightened child a hard truth because you have decided the lie would wound it worse. She said, You were never going to escape the date. None of us escaped the date. The void does not erase the date. Hear me, because no one will say this to you again. The only thing the file has ever given anyone, the only gift in the whole of this work is the 4 days. The void does not erase your death. It erases the 4 days. That is all the void has ever done in 100 years of frightened clerks reaching for it. It has never once, not a single time, saved a life. It has only ever shortened one. I asked her because at the very bottom of everything I had to ask whether the 4 days could be wrong, whether a certificate just once could be mistaken, whether anyone in all the long history of that basement had ever let an inverted file simply stand and walked into the 4th day and lived past it. She was quiet for a long time. The radiators knocked, the lights hummed their one unchanging note. The fog pressed gray against the little window where no shoes passed anymore because the day above us had ended. And then she said that she did not know, that in all her years she had never known a single soul who let their own file stand and live to tell what happened on the 4th day, because the ones who let it stand were never there afterward to tell anyone anything, and she had never known anyone survive the void either, because the ones who voided their files died that same afternoon, early, exactly as Mr. Pell had described. And so the honest answer, the answer the office had spent a century keeping fires burning over rather than speak aloud, was that no one alive knew whether the date was a prophecy or a sentence, a thing foreseen or a thing imposed, because the office had never once in the whole of its history simply done nothing and waited with open eyes to see. The office had always either served the date or fought it, obeyed the file or voided it. It had never tested it, because to test it, you would have to let your own file stand, knowing what it meant, and walk forward into the 4th day with your eyes open and learn the answer in the only place the answer could be learned, which was inside your own ending. And no clerk in 100 years, not one, had ever wanted the answer badly enough to die for the chance of knowing it. I let the file stand. I put down the stamp. The small sound of it returning to the table is the loudest sound in my memory of that whole long career. I logged the file the way it was written, my own surname, the stranger's first name, the 4-day death, the empty petition line in my own shaking hand, and I carried it to the shelf, and I slid it into its alphabetical place between 2 strangers, the last filing of my life. And then I climbed the worn smooth stairs out of that basement for the final time, past Eldred, who did not say goodbye, who only watched me go with an expression I have never since been able to name, and I did not return to work the next day or any day after. I went home to my cold tea and my empty rooms, and I waited. I am telling you this on the 4th day. I want to be careful here, more careful than anywhere else, because I am an old man, and the pull to make a grand and final spectacle of my own death is very strong. And I have promised you the truth from the very beginning, and the truth is plainer and stranger and far heavier than any spectacle. Nothing has come for me today. The fog outside my window is the same fog it has always been. The clock on my wall has moved its hands the way clocks move them, with no special urgency, no menace, only the ordinary slow arithmetic of an afternoon. I have made tea and let it go cold beside me the way I always do, the way I have done every afternoon for 19 years and all the years since. There has been no figure at the glass, no knock upon the door, no cold hand upon my shoulder, no shape assembling in the corner of the room. If you have been waiting for me to tell you that something climbed up out of that basement and crossed the foggy town and came into my home, I cannot give you that ending, because it has not happened, and I will not invent it, because to invent it would be the one act that finally made me a liar in a confession it has cost me everything to keep honest. But the day is not over. The light is going gray and then grayer in the window. And here is the thing I have come to understand, sitting in this chair as the afternoon thins, with my cold tea at my elbow and the clock counting down in the ordinary way. I do not know whether I am about to die. That is the true horror of it, and it is a quieter horror than I ever imagined in all my years of dreading it, and a far worse one. The file said today, the file has never once been wrong in 100 years of unbroken records. But the file has also never in all those years simply been left alone to find out, because every clerk before me either obeyed it or fought it, and obedience and resistance are only two different ways of refusing to know. I am the first, as best I can tell, to simply sit still inside my own prediction and wait, neither serving the date nor striking at it. And so I am about to become the first to learn the one thing the office spent a century in a hidden fire, making certain no one would ever learn. I find to my surprise that I am not afraid in the way I always assumed I would be. I am afraid in a different way entirely. I am afraid that nothing will happen at all. Because if nothing happens, if this fourth day simply passes the way days pass and I am still here in this chair when the streetlights come on, then the file was never a prophecy. It was only ever a sentence, and the office carried it out itself quietly with both hands across 100 years on the schedule it had chosen and written down in advance. And every death in that basement for a century was not foretold but performed, and the 4 days were never a mercy at all. They were a countdown the office kept and honored, and I have spent the whole of my life as a faithful clerk inside a thing I chose to call fate, because fate was bearable, because fate asked nothing of me but accuracy, and I never once allowed myself to see that it was something far simpler and far worse, a hand, writing names and keeping its appointments. I do not know which of these is the worst thing to be true. To die today because it was written before I was born, or to live and to carry forward into whatever years remain the knowledge of what the writing truly was and whose hand truly held the pen. So I will leave you the way the work left me, with the door standing open and the arithmetic unfinished. If you should ever find yourself in a county office, in a basement below the basement, turning the pages of an old book with both hands as you were taught, and you notice that a file has been opened before the person in it died, I will not tell you to run. Running does nothing. The function has all the time there is, and your legs are only legs. I will not tell you to void it. Voiding it only draws the date toward you and shortens the one small mercy you have been given. I will tell you instead the one thing no one ever told me, the thing I had to sit alone in the gray and failing light of my own last afternoon to finally understand. Check whether the petitioner line is blank, because if there is a name there, a real name in honest ink, then someone somewhere among the living asked for that door to open. And a thing requested by the living is a thing that still belongs, however terribly, to the human world. But the only door in all that office that has ever truly frightened me, the only one I have never once been able to stop turning over in the dark as the light fails and the fourth day thins toward its end, is the one with no name on the petition at all, because a file with no petitioner was not requested by anyone living. It was opened by the office itself. And I have begun to wonder here at the end, with the tea gone cold and the fog at the glass and the clock moving its hands the way clocks move them, whether the office was ever a building at all, or whether I have spent 19 years working inside the thing,